Okay. Hi, John.
Hey,
I'll
good
ask the
afternoon.
lawyer. Is it okay if I record this?
Ah, I play one on TV. That's all.
Okay.
I,
Um,
I got a good night's sleep with my Holiday Inn Express last night. So here you go.
you traveling?
No, no, I'm joking. That's an ad. I'm not a doctor, but I got a good night's sleep last night. No, I'm not traveling. I am next week though. I'm going to Colorado, so that'll be good.
Oh,
So
good. Excellent.
yeah. How's everyone doing?
All right. We're doing well.
Cool.
So,
Not a ski trip by any chance, is it? Because they're not having much snow out there.
Yeah, I got to scope it out. I mean,
Oof.
yeah, we're going to Winter Park, so we'll see how that
Good,
trends.
good luck.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't checked. I haven't had time to check the report. So,
huh.
Where
you been
does
out
all the
yet, Al, or
time
no?
go?
Well, good luck, sir.
Yeah.
Um, so I want to talk about the Battle of the River Plate or Plata. It's a river off Montevideo, Uruguay. It actually separates Uruguay from Argentina a bit. And we're talking about December 13th, 1939. So a December battle, I thought deserved a December talk. And I've known about this battle for quite some time, and I thought, and of course, I was just talking to my wife about how to pronounce Plata. She asked what the talk was about. She goes, I never heard of it. And I said, and that's why we're doing the history talk. So we have a picture here of the Deutschland class Panzerschiff, what the British called a pocket battleship. The Germans would refer to as a heavy cruiser starting in 1940. And it is the Admiral Graf Spee, one of three of the Deutschland class, and we'll talk about where they came from. Um, so the Panzerschiffs were designed under the Weimar Republic. They were not, they were built actually before the Nazis came to power. And they were designed to meet the very restrictive conditions of the Versailles Treaty, which had greatly limited the German Navy's ability to build stuff. And they couldn't build anything over 10,000 tons. And if they built this thing, they had to replace one of the old pre-dreadnoughts that they had been allowed to keep, had to take it out of commission. So the Germans building to 10,000 tons said, let's make this big and nasty. So they built it with 11-inch guns, which is sort of a pre-dreadnought battleship type armament, but very large for a cruiser, but only two turrets. Was designed to go very fast at 28 knots, and it's going to have a diesel propulsion system, which makes it very um, economical for cruising and long range. Uh, like all German ships, everybody approached the weight treaties with different approaches. The Japanese and the Germans tend to lean on, well, let's just make it up. So even though they claimed it was a 10,000 tonner, it really came in at fully loaded at 16,000 tons. There's three ships in the class, the Admiral Graf Spee, the Deutschland, which once the war begins, Hitler demands be renamed. He doesn't want a ship named after the country to be sunk, so they renamed that Lutzow, and then the Admiral Scheer. Um, Spee and Scheer were both admirals during World War One in the Reichsmarine, not the Reichsmarine. What did they call it? Oh, I don't know.
Kriegsmarine.
No, I don't think it was even the Kriegsmarine in World War One.
I believe it might have been.
Kaiserliche Marine, I think, is the official name. Okay, so who was von Spee? Maximilian von Spee. He was the commander of the German East Asian Squadron. And for those who may not be familiar with this history, Germany held a piece of the Chinese coast around Tsingtao. And they had held it since essentially the Boxer Rebellion, and it was part of their attempt to have a greater global enterprise. And by the way, that's why we get Tsingtao beer, because they taught the Chinese how to make beer. Um, and they had a colonial squadron of a couple of cruisers, couple armored cruisers, and some lighter ships based there. But when World War One started, the Germans realized that they were hemmed in by the Australians to the south, and the Australians had a big, nasty battle cruiser that could give them trouble. And then if the Japanese came in on the side of the Britons, which they kind of expected because the Japanese and the British had a treaty at the time, now they got to face the entire Japanese Navy. And von Spee says, you know what? I better boogity boogie for home. And he's got two ways home. He can go around, uh, the Cape of Good Horn, but he's got to pass through, past Singapore, which is a British base, past Australia, which is a British base. And he's like, yeah, it's not going to go well. So he decides he's got to go around the Cape Horn, South America. So he starts booting his way across the Pacific. And there's all these sightings of their ships as they're working their way east. And the British are trying to race whatever they've got out there to chase after him to prevent mischief. He does raid various ships along his way. I think he bombards some British protectorate along the way, and gets spotted. But he has to recoal on the coast of Chile. And off the coast of Chile, he is intercepted by a British armored cruiser squadron under the command of Christopher Craddock. And Christopher Craddock is outgunned. His squadron cannot match the German squadron, but he comes from a long tradition of the British, which is, if I fail to take this guy on, they're going to cashier me for being a coward. So, long leg of the king, here we go. And the Craddock squadron is very quickly erased off the map. And then he's trying to race home around the squadron, around the Cape Horn, and he's aimed for the Falklands, which are very southernmost islands off the coast of Argentina, a British protectorate. And his thinking is, we'll raid the Falklands. Maybe if we're lucky, we'll catch a ship or two there to get coal from, and with any luck. But what he doesn't realize is the Admiralty has moved down two battle cruisers to just completely wipe them off the map. So they send down a squadron. There's battle cruisers, there's old pre-naught pre-dreadnought battleship called the Canopus lying in Falklands Harbor. And the Japanese show up, and the first inkling that they're in trouble, I mean, the Germans show up, and the first inkling they're in trouble is when 12-inch shells from the Canopus start landing around them, and they're like, oh, we got to get the hell out of here. And as they try to race away, the much faster and bigger and nastier British battle cruisers catch up with them and sink von Spee's squadron in almost its entirety. So this is the Battle of the Falkland Islands. So the Weimar Republic will name the Deutschland class Graf Spee after Admiral Maximilian von Spee. But what's interesting is this sort of lays very common groundwork you see both in World War I and World War II about the Germans reacting to somebody else having any kind of activity that might threaten the sea lanes. The British rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. They're not going to put up with that, and they're going to do whatever they can to shut it down as fast as they can. So we come to the Admiral Graf Spee. She's commissioned in 1936. And she takes part in the non-intervention patrol wars, the interventionist non-intervention patrols during the Spanish Civil War. The Germans leaned heavily on the side of the fascists trying to overthrow the Spanish government.
Hey, Bruce,
Yeah.
I'm unfamiliar with the non-intervention patrols during the Spanish Civil War. What was that about?
Well, basically, several countries, this would be Britain, France, and Germany, all declare we're going to go patrol off the coast of Spain and try to prevent arms shipments to either side. And of course, the British and the French are trying to prevent arms shipments to the fascists. The Germans are trying to prevent arms shipments to the Republicans. Either side. So non-intervening um, in that way, and that it's almost like a mild blockade by neutral countries to prevent arms from going in and escalating the conflict.
All right, thanks.
Um, I called them interventionist in that, the ships get some of the German ships get bombed, so they bombard a port city back in um, in retaliation. Of course, the Germans send in the Condor Legion, German volunteers who were going to fly for the fascists in Spain. Volunteers my butt. The Russians also intervene in Spain. So the Admiral Graf Spee will be seen at the Great Coronation Review for King George VI in May 1937. This is where King George VI is taking over for his deposed brother Edward. And so the Navy throws a big hullabaloo, and that's a big deal because everybody else gets to stare at everybody else's ships for the first time. So, like the Japanese sent one of their new modern cruisers, and in naval terms, they get all excited about looking at each other's ships. So she is sent to sea along with one of her sister ship, I think the Deutschland. At the time prior to the start of the war, with instructions not to open fire until they're instructed to once war starts. And they won't get instructions to open fire for 5, 6, 7 days after the start of the war. Kind of in Hitler's hope that the British would not come into the war. But anyway, they start cruising around the Atlantic, and they're going to sink 50,000 tons of shipping, 9 vessels. And then they're going to head into the Indian Ocean, and they're just playing cat and mouse with the British Navy. They are supported by a series of pre-positioned supply ships with oil and more ammunition and food substances. And they're going to play cat and mouse, roaming from September to December, roaming the Atlantic, then the Indian. And they're on the way back to the Atlantic because he's got to start heading for home. Um, when they sink a particular ship, the Doric Star, which manages to get off a radio distress signal before it's just sunk. And that gives the British a hint that they're headed back towards the Atlantic. And we will see that come into play. So the British, and I was talking about, there's a long British tradition of dealing with lesser naval powers trying to interfere with their shipping. And it goes back to the age of sails. In fact, that's what the Americans were trying to do in 1812. The French repeatedly tried to do it. The Germans tried it in World War I. Send out raiders to disrupt shipping. And the U-boat is the ultimate raider for the Germans in World War I and World War II. But the French tried it for years. And that's why the British Navy the British Navy takes pride in, hey, we've got a worldwide empire. We've got to protect the worldwide empire. And one thing the British always built was a very large number of cruiser type ships or fast, lighter, heavily armed ships that would have been frigates or third rates back in the age of sail to patrol the oceans of the world to prevent mischief by these lesser powers. So the British take it very seriously if one of these enemy cruisers is trying to disrupt trade lines. So the first thing they do is they form 8 battle groups, and the various battle groups to chase after the Von Spee and anything else out there causing mischief. They will include 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battle cruisers, 2 of which are French, 16 cruisers. And one of the commands that they form is a Force G under Commodore Henry Harwood. And he's assigned to patrol the South Atlantic. And he's given 2 heavy cruisers. And heavy cruisers here in the World War II parlance means they have 8-inch guns. Exeter and Cumberland, 2 different classes of cruisers, by the way. And then the 2 sister ships, which are light cruisers, which means they have 6-inch guns. And they are the Achilles and the Ajax. Now, what's interesting is the Achilles is actually not a British ship. It is a New Zealand ship. It's a HMNZ ship. And this will be the first time that a New Zealand warship goes into action.
Hey, Bruce,
Yeah.
before we leave there, I understand the concept of heavy cruiser, light cruiser based on gun weight. How does a battle cruiser, what's the battle cruiser versus a regular cruiser, the 3 versus the 16 up top? Are that just different words for heavy and light, or they
Well,
different?
yeah, the 16 cruisers would include heavy and lights. Battle
Okay,
cruisers, by definition, are warships with a very high rate of speed, thinner armor than a battleship, but carrying battleship level caliber guns.
okay, so
So 12, 14, 16
a big fast cruiser with bigger guns.
with much bigger guns.
A
Okay,
little
thank
bit
you.
heavier armored than a regular heavy
Heavier
cruiser
armored
as
than a
well.
regular cruiser, but not as heavily armored as a battleship.
Got it.
Right.
All
Okay.
right, thanks.
So they're designed to really mess up a cruiser. But as Jutland showed in 1916, battleships can really make a mess of battle cruisers can make a mess of each other because they've got these hard-hitting guns, but not armor to withstand them. One of the principles of battleship design is that you should design your battleship so that it has enough armor to withstand the caliber of guns it's actually carrying. And a battle cruiser violates that standard. They go for high speed. Basically the old maxim of sink anything that can catch them and run away from anything that can sink them. Um, and that's why this 11-inch gun of the Graf Spee is interesting because it's sort of a sub caliber. I mean, the Americans have a couple of 12-inch battleships still in the fleet in 1940. Um, the Germans had an 11-inch gun all through World War One, but British and Americans and Japanese, I think, had gotten away from it by then, had scrapped much of their 11-inch stuff. Um, so here you got a cruiser that's carrying a fairly nasty gun. And this 11-inch gun of the Graf Spee can mess up the heavy cruisers of the British Navy. But what's interesting is Harwood um, is the guy who has been pondering how to address the threat of these commerce raiding by these panzer ships since they were built. And he wrote the initial British paper on here's what we're going to do when one of these things gets into the open ocean. We're going to hunt it down, and we're going to hunt it down with packs of cruisers. And in particular, I want to hunt it down with enough cruisers in each command so that they can split the fire of the German. And if the German, and basically, if you got 3 ships, the German can only shoot at 2 of them at a time. So you've got to have at least 3 ships. If they concentrate all their fire on one ship, then all the other ships can concentrate their fire back. And while 6 and 8-inch guns cannot damage the armor um, of a Panzer ship, they can mess up everything else.
So,
Antennas and radar and range finding and stuff.
so similar to the Sherman tactics against the Tigers.
Right. You got a nice tire. It's a nice big heavy tank, but hey, we're going to throw 50 Shermans at you. Good luck to you, lad. You know. All right. So the battle begins. Harwood has figured out that, or he estimated that they were going to head for the River Plate, which is off Uruguay down in the bottom third of the bulge below Brazil there in South America. And he says they'll go the River Plate because that's a major traffic area for shipping. It's a major choke point, and you want to concentrate. If you wander the open ocean, it's harder for you to find something. The Germans are a little set back in that in one of their actions, they've actually damaged their spotting float plane. So they will not have a spotter available to scout ahead and see what they're up against. The key to the British strategy is that they don't need to win the battle. They just need to mess up the German ship enough so that it can't get home. That it's either damaged and can't limp home, or it's slowed down so that that gives the British Navy to go home. This ship is going to pass by the entirety of the British Navy, as you can imagine, to go up around the North Sea and get into Germany. And if they can just damage it, slow it down, then they've achieved a strategic victory. They can lose the battle tactically and strategically win if they damage the ship. He's at the time he's only got the Exeter, the Achilles, and the Ajax. At the time the Graf Spee shows up, because the Cumberland is off to the Falklands, undergoing repair. Now the Falklands are that blob of islands down on the bottom, just above the 60-degree mark on this map, if you will, off the coast of Argentina. The German commander Langsdorff, when he first sees the British squadron, the mass of the British squadron, he thinks, it's a convoy escort, a cruiser and a couple of destroyers. Oh boy, convoys, that's why I'm here. Yippee, let's go. And he starts charging in, and the British see him coming, and they're getting ready for action. And he comes charging in, and he goes, oh, wait a minute, it's three cruisers. It's not a destroyer, it's not a convoy. And he realizes his mistake, and he closes into within range of the British cruisers, which, he could have stood off and pounded on them. Now, the British do have a speed advantage. So if he had tried to haul off and pound them from range, they could have just stayed out of his range. Or they can get quickly into their range to mess with him. And as I said, there's a long, long tradition in the British Navy of, you want to start a fight, we're coming for you, even if we're outnumbered. And there's actually instances of British destroyers under overwhelmed in terms on paper, charging in amongst German destroyers multiple times during this war. It's like the British are like, we don't care. We are the British Navy. We're coming in. We're going to mess with you. And so Harwood charges in. The Graf Spee in the ongoing battle, which lasts several hours, is actually going to become doomed. And the Graf Spee first concentrates its fire on the heavy cruiser Exeter as the one likely to do its most damage. And after 1 hour, the Exeter is two of its forward turrets are out of action, and it's only got its rear turret, and it's wrecked. And the bridge has been wrecked, and the ship is listing and taking on water, and it's been slowed down. It's really heavily hampered, yet it stays in the fight because, by God, this is the Royal Navy. But during this hour, the Graf Spee has taken several critical hits. One of them was which destroys the oil processing system. So this being a diesel, they can't just use straight bunker oil. They've got to process it down to diesel to use it to make their ship propel. And when they damage this processing system, they're not going to be able to fix that piece of machinery at sea. And at the time of the damage, they estimated they only had 16 hours more worth of sailing fuel. So they're going to run out of fuel. They've also fired off a large portion of its ammunition, which will become critical in what goes on. 40 minutes later, as the Exeter's zooming in and out and still firing with its rear turret, its last turret is knocked off by a near miss of all things. And the Graf Spee is trying to move in to finish it off when the Ajax and Achilles drew its attention. And now the British cruisers have all of the ships here have torpedoes. And so the British cruisers want on occasion dash in to fire off a torpedo or two, which will throw the Germans off a bit. And the Ajax and Achilles, they're not heavily damaging the main armored structure of the ship, but they are messing up the rest of the Graf Spee, making it. And so the Graf Spee gets distracted, doesn't put the finishing touches off on the Exeter, and the Exeter starts limping off for the Falklands. 20 minutes later, so we're 2 hours into the battle, the light cruisers have now been hit and they're damaged. and they're going to fall back. They're going to use their uh, superior speed to stay out of range of the Graf Spee, but keep trailing it. And the Graf Spee needs some repairs, and so they make for the neutral port of Montevideo in Uruguay.
Hey, Bruce,
Yeah.
I wanted to catch before we leave this slide. How are the guns knocked out by a near miss?
How did the guns get knocked out by a near miss? Either shrapnel or it knocked them out of alignment. So near misses are so shrapnel could also uh,
Okay,
It could have dislodged the turret enough to keep it from being usable.
rotatable.
okay, all right, got it. So it hit, but it wasn't a direct hit type
It
thing.
wasn't a direct hit. It was a
Got it.
close
Okay.
enough hit to
So that's right.
jolt the thing.
When you said near miss, I imagined the shell going into the water, and I was like, how the hell did that knock
Well,
out a gun?
even that jolt, enough of a violent jolt can, near
Shake it
misses
up.
near
Got
misses
it.
were known to, basically throw destroyers into the air, So
Okay.
11 inch,
Especially with an 11-inch shell as opposed to the small 5-inchers.
yeah.
All right. Thank
Yeah,
you.
11. I think some of the near misses from the Yamato at the Battle of Lady Gulf really knocked some of the British American destroyers about. You know, as the historians I like to listen to say, an 11-inch has a lot of boom boom. Into a technical term. So they head to Montevideo. Now the mistake with Montevideo is it's the port city of Uruguay, and it's on the River Plate. And Montevideo, Uruguay is actually sort of British leaning. And the British really have a cozy relationship with the Uruguayans. The He would have been much better heading for an Argentinian port, but they were farther away and he couldn't figure out how to get them. And according to international law, the Hague Convention allows a combatant to stay only 24 hours unless there is damage. And Langsdorff was hoping to stay a couple, 3 days to fix up some of his key damage before he tried to make a bolt for it. And at the time he went into the harbor, there's only two British ships out the harbor, the damaged Achilles and Ajax, and they're standing on guard outside the harbor, and they're making all sorts of smoke to say, "Hey, just let you know we're still here." Haha. He's certainly got to fix his oil refinery system before he can try and sail at a minimum. And at first, the British are trying to get the Uruguayans to force him out, force him out, force him out. Don't let him make his repairs. Send a limping ship to sea. We'll deal with it when it gets out there. And the Uruguayans are pressing the Germans, and the Germans are pressing back. And then, kind of quickly, the British change their tact. They're like, "Wait a minute! If we can hold them in this harbor, we can hopefully wait until reinforcements are on our life." Like the Cumberland is on its way, and they've got a force of a battle cruiser and a carrier racing for the South Atlantic, but they're 2,000 miles away, so it's going to take some time, you know. So the British start going for a delay tactic. And under international law, one of the tactics is that if a neutral ship leaves a port, an enemy ship may not leave for 24 hours after that neutral port ship leaves. So the British and French began to force their merchant ships to sea one at a time, perfectly spaced to delay the departure of the Graf Spee. And the next thing the British are going to do is they're going to start trying to freak out the Germans. And they start uh, placing orders for a large amount of fuel to be available at the next major port north of Montevideo. Like, please have enough fuel available for two large warships, capital ships. And, hoping that that leaks as it does, of course, to the Germans. They start using unsecure telephone lines to discuss the ships that are coming towards them, um, hoping and expecting that information will be passed to the Germans. Langsdorff is in communication with the German Admiralty at this point. I'm like, what the hell do I do? Um, um, and eventually the HMS Cumberland arrives off, and now the British are back to where they were at the beginning of the battle, but with a fresh 8-inch heavy cruiser. And the Cumberland's actually got not 3 turrets, but 4. So if the Graf Spee decides to come out, they're going to be facing the same situation, only they've got less ammunition and they've been slightly damaged. So in the end, Langsdorff is given 3 choices by his admiralty. Fight it out. And he's like, I'm not doing that. I'm not risking the crew pointlessly. He says you can stay in Uruguay, but Uruguay is kind of British leaning. What do we do? Make a break for it for more friendly Argentina. But he's now fallen trapped to the British deceptions and thinking that if I go out there, if I try to leave this harbor, they're just going to sink me. They've got a big force on its way, and I'm doomed. So he sets sail with a very skeleton crew, goes to the outer harbor of Montevideo, and basically sets the scuttling charges and blows up the ship. I got a picture of the ship lying on the sandbar here, flaming wreck. This is like 2, 3 days after the battle. Langsdorff will write a letter of apology to the German government and then commit suicide for his having lost a major capital ship of the German Navy. The crew will be interned in Uruguay for the entirety of the war. So Langsdorff did save his crew. There's a parsonage set much of the wreck is still there on the bottom of the Montevideo Harbor, the River Plate estuary. But they did in 2004 do a partial salvage. And on the right-hand picture on the bottom, you see them pulling up a rangefinder. And in the middle picture, you see them pulling up the eagle's crest that was on the front of the ship that's got the Nazi swastika. And the Uruguayan government, having pulled up this relic, are like, oh, crikes, swastikas are a bad emblem. We can't exactly put this son of a gun on display. Um, what do we do with it? And so it's sitting in a museum while they debate what's the proper way to deal with it.
Hey,
Yeah.
Bruce, the internment in Uruguay. I don't know much about that kind of stuff. What did that entail for for German troops? I'm assuming it wasn't like a POW camp.
No, they're just not allowed to travel. It's not a POW camp. They can live in Uruguay, and
Okay,
the German you know, embassy will, supply them with a means of living and stuff. They just can't leave.
okay, got it. Thanks.
They have no permission to leave. You're stuck. All right, so we have the Altmark incident, which is related to this. So the Altmark was one of the many supply ships that the Graf Spee had been using in its mischief behavior, and the Altmark actually was the last ship to see the Graf Spee, German ship to see the before it sunk. And the Altmark was returning home to Germany and had over 300 British merchant seamen, almost 300 British merchant seamen, as prisoners aboard the ship. And the British are trying to track the Altmark and find it, but the ocean's a big place and they don't have any luck finding it. And eventually they do locate that it's entered Norwegian territorial waters. And at this time, Norway is still neutral. And the British Navy decides, you know what, we're going to board this thing even in Norwegian territorial waters. Now, the Norwegians have been escorting this ship through their territorial waters so it doesn't create mischief. But they've got 2 small gunboats escorting it and sitting next to it in this fjord where it's sitting, waiting a chance to make a dash south. And there's no international law against transporting prisoners of war, although the Germans are not admitting prisoners of war. The Norwegians will have actually boarded the ship 4 times and never seen evidence of the prisoners. They're locked down in a hold. There is an instance where a British warship has passed through the Panama Canal while America was neutral with German prisoners. But the British said that we're doing this. We are carrying a cargo of prisoners. So there's really no international, they're not, the Germans aren't violating anything international except the British Navy doesn't like 299 of their guys being hauled off to captivity. So they send in a destroyer, the Cossack, HMS Cossack, and they say, stop that ship. We release the prisoners. We know it's got prisoners aboard it. And he comes in, and the Norwegians are like, get out of here. This is territorial waters. Don't you create any mischief. And the British captain, Captain Vian, he basically says to the Norwegians, he goes, look, they've got British prisoners aboard. I want to release those prisoners. I'm going to board their ship. You can join me in the boarding and searching of their ship if you'd like, but I'm going to board their ship one way or the other. And he's given instructions by the Admiralty. Don't make trouble with the Norwegians. Don't fire on the Norwegians. Even if they fire on you, only fire back if you have to in extremes of defense. Do not cause trouble with the Norwegians. We're a little bit worried about Norwegian neutrality here. So Vian says to the Norwegian two boats that are guarding him, well, I'm going in. And he ranges alongside the Altmark and he sends over a boarding party. And there's a kerfuffle, and 10 Germans are killed. A number of them are wounded. A couple of the British are wounded in the kerfuffle. And they find a locked down hatch. And the British sailors open it and say, are there any Englishmen here? And they hear back hundreds of voices says, yes, we are all British. And the response, which goes down in British Royal Navy lore, is, well, the Navy's here. And that became a big thing. What's interesting, and this is going to cause a diplomatic row, and we see the British uh, uh, internees carrying off a German dead coffin here. The Altmark will be allowed to go on its way back home. The British are not stopping the ship; they just released the prisoners and then got on their way as stopping contraband. What's interesting is I've got a picture of this old blue card here, and Frank knows this deck well. A friend of mine gave me a deck of World War II stories. These are what 5 by 5 inch index cards. Um, uh, Sherpa Jim, my college roommate, gave these to me. He bought these back in the 60s or 70s. And they each tell a little interesting story with a picture. And so, and some of those stories, Frank and we read all the cards. And we're like, I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
These provided many hours of interesting reading, and led to several rabbit hole searches on the web about things I didn't know anything about. It was very interesting. Took a while to get through them all.
Yeah, but if anybody, I've got the entire set. If anybody needs to blow several hundred hours of completely non-productive time, just let me know and we can set that up for you. So it's a great set. Maybe what I'll do is for some of our future talks, I'll pull out some of these cards like, who knew this one? You know.
Or Bruce, maybe a suggestion if you're looking for a topic, pick four that are lesser known things and have the group pick one for the next topic.
Yeah. We'll do that.
Okay.
Anyway, so what happens to the HMX Exeter? Because it becomes a rather famous ship. It was so badly damaged that it limped back. They patched it up at the Falklands and sent it back home. And the Admiralty took one look at this ship and said, yeah, we're not wasting our time and resources on rebuilding this wreck. We'll just scrap it. And Churchill's like, no, such a gallant ship must be brought back into Navy service. And so they spend a year and a half patching this thing back up and getting it to work. And when they got it all working and shiny and brand spanking clean again, they sent it to the Far East to join the Eastern Fleet. And it will be sunk by the Japanese off the Battle of Java as part of the ABCD command that uh, uh, is unable to stop the Japanese expansion of early 42. So here's a picture of the HMX Exeter sinking in 42. The sad thing about some of the wrecks, so if you know your history, is that a number of ships were sunk as part of the ABCD command. Exeter was sunk. The Houston, USS Houston, the Perth, the two British battleships, Prince of Wales and Repulse, were sunk off Singapore. These ships have been illegally scrapped, illegally salvaged by a Chinese firm in the 2000s, 2010s. And so the wreck of the Exeter no longer exists. It's just a dent in the seafloor where it used to was. One of the reasons the Chinese are so intent on salvaging these wrecks is that pre-war metals do not have any of the contaminations. Pre-war steel does not have any of the contamination that modern steel has that has come from all the nuclear testing we've done over the years. And so pre-war steel really has value in being used in sensitive medical equipment where you need to detect x-rays and stuff because it doesn't give off a false positive due to natural radiation of our world today. But it's sad. Um, these were all considered war graves and considered protected. And under international law, they still are the property of the nation whose ship it was, a sunk warship. So you're not allowed to touch it. But these Chinese salvagers, other American warships are being watched much more closely to make sure this isn't happening to some of the American war graves. But the British, just in the last 20 years, have lost a number of wrecks this way. The Germans continued to do other raids. So in November of 39, around the same time up in the North Atlantic, the two German battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Now these are much larger ships, but they still have only 11-inch guns. Only they've got 3 turrets of them. They're faster, they're more heavily armed. So they are rated as battle cruisers as compared to heavy cruisers, even though they have the same armament, the same 11-inch caliber gun as the Deutschlands. They're considered battle cruisers because there's more of them and they're more heavily armed. What's interesting about the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau is that they are two sister ships, and the British, being the British, always cracking jokes and making stuff off, referred to them as Salmon and Gluckstein. Now, Salmon and Gluckstein were a haberdashery outfit well known in London. So instead of pronouncing the German name Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, they would refer to it in dispatches as Salmon and Gluckstein. And you were all supposed to know just what ships they were talking about. I think it's interesting, the British one. Their famous action is where they sink the auxiliary cruiser Rawalpindi, and there's a picture of them coming across a convoy that's only escorted by a merchant ship that's had some guns put on it, what they call a merchant cruiser. And the Rawalpindi, even though outgunned and outmatched, charges at and takes on these, again in the British tradition. I'm not letting you near my convoy. Here we go. And is actually able to damage, I think, the Gneisenau enough that it has to retreat before it itself is sunk. The Lutzow, the sister ship of the Graf May, does a raid off Greenland that nets only 2 ships, including 1 U.S. ship to be deemed carrying U.S. contraband. Now, they don't sink it, they just put a prize crew on it, but they have captured a U.S. ship here. And this is 1939. Throughout the war, the Germans will do less and less in the Atlantic, certainly less in the Indian Ocean. And they start, when they have occupied Norway, they start trying to stop the convoys from Britain to Russia, to supply Russia. These are the famed Arctic convoys. And it winds up in a couple of noticeable instances. One is Christmas Day, December 1943, off the North Cape, the northernmost point of Norway, the Scharnhorst, which I talked about earlier, is set upon by a British battleship, the Duke of York, and is sunk in a horrendous weather on Christmas Day with, I think, no survivors. And it was out there trying to, intercept the northbound convoy to the Russians. There's another event which I don't know if you've ever heard of, but one of the Arctic convoys, PQ-13, um, which also sailed on Friday the 13th. So all the good sailors in the thing are like, you named it PQ-13. You let it set sail on the 13th. There were 13 ships in convoy. What the hell were you thinking? Anyway, it goes out, and the Germans have a battleship called the Tirpitz. It's a sister ship of the famed Bismarck. And the Tirpitz sets sail to intercept the convoy, but then turns around and heads back to port and does not continue. But the British knew that it sailed, but not that it turned around. And so the Admiralty ordered PQ-13 to scatter. That the best way to deal with U-boats was to stay as a tight-knit convoy with an escort. The best way to deal with a raider like the Tirpitz is to scatter. They scattered the convoy, and the Luftwaffe and the U-boats began to proceed to sink almost everything in PQ-13. I think only one or two ships made it, survived that. One of which went up into the pack ice and painted itself white and sat in the pack ice for a couple of days. So it couldn't be spotted. But this is known as the convoy slaughter, and it will PQ-13 slaughter will lead to the convoys being stopped for a while until uh, better escort setups occur. So, Operation Berlin, January March 1941, was a really good sailing by the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. It covered the Atlantic from Greenland to the West Atlantic. They supported by 7 supply ships, and they will sink 22 ships for 115,000 tons. They do come across one convoy that has a battleship escort. They're like, yep, we're not mucking with that. They bay off. And after this raid, they will head to Brest, France, to be off the coast of France to threaten further attacks. But all they do for the next year when they're sitting in France is become target of the RAF bombers that are constant. And the RAF practically wrecks the harbor of Brest trying to hit these two ships. They will return to Germany in September of 42, I think, in what's known as the Channel Dash. And for those who don't know what the Channel Dash is, they've realized that if they leave the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau and the Hipper, I think is the other ship with them, or the Prince Eugen, another heavy cruiser, is sitting with them. If they leave them in Brest, the British bombers will just keep coming and eventually sink them. So they're going to try and make a break for home, which means, and your choices are to go all the way around Britain or to go straight up the channel. Now, the channel is heavily guarded and it's actually got naval guns guarding it and airplanes and torpedo boats and destroyers, and the British home fleet is capping up at the north of it. And so they order this dash, um, and due to a series of errors on the British part, they pick up that this dash is happening late, um, and the British make only half-hearted attempts to stop the dash, and only light damage from a mine happens to get us on its way, and the Germans make it through. This is the first enemy fleet to pass through the channel since the Armada of 1588, and the British are freaking mortified. We are the British Navy. How does a enemy fleet pass this close to our shores and we don't just sink it outright? They are absolutely mortified by the Channel Dash. Operation Rheinberg, May of 1941. It's a sortie by the Bismarck and the Prince Eugen. Was a famed event where the goal was to disrupt Atlantic convoys, then join the Gneisenau and Scharnhorst and Brest. But it's happening at the same time of the Greek evacuations in the Mediterranean. The British are having to evacuate Greece as the Germans take over Greece. it is sort of the lowest point in terms of May of 1941 is sort of one of the most dangerous points of the British power in World War One, where there was just too freaking much going on, and but they do hunt down they first send out as everybody, I assume everybody knows about. They first send out the Hood and the Prince of Wales to take on the ships in the Denmark Strait, and the Hood is sunk. And then 3 days later, because the Bismarck has been damaged, it's trying to return to Brest. It is going to be caught up to and sunk by the combined fire of the King George V and the Rodney with torpedoes from the cruiser Dorsetshire. But in this attempt to retreat, two aircraft carriers will also do damaging attacks to the Bismarck and jam its rudder. So this was another attempted raid into the Atlantic. They're going to stop doing major raids by warships except for the object convoy, but they do have very successful merchant raiders where they take a merchant ship, they disguise it as a merchant ship, but then they arm it to the teeth with all sorts of weapons and they send these out. So they have 12 of what they call these Hilfs cruisers. And here's some of the more famous ones. The Cormorant versus the HMS Sydney ends up in a battle of November 1941 off Australia, where both ships sink. The Sydney, which is a much more powerful ship, had made the mistake of letting the Cormorant get too close. The Sydney could have just stood off and pounded it, but because they weren't sure that what the Cormorant was and they were coming close to investigate it, it got within range and the Cormorant opened fire. The Sydney sank without survivors, and so for much of the war, the Australians didn't know what happened to the Sydney. It just disappeared. The Cormorant, up to that point, had captured 11 ships. The Atlantis captures 22 ships, 144,000 tons. By the way, if you were to look at the leading German aces and leading German U-boat aces of the war, 144 tons is sort of like one of the leading aces would have that much. That would be a higher ranking. It's going to be sunk by the HMS Devonshire in November 1941. So you see some of these same dates. The British are really trying to cleanse the sea of these troublemakers. The Comet, operating in the Pacific, sinks 7 ships, 41,000 tons, and it's trying to do a second raid, breaking out in 1942, and is caught in the Bay of Biscay and sunk. The Orion sinks 10 ships and 63 tons, but then is converted back to merchant role. Excuse me. The Thor, on its first cruise, sinks 12 ships, 96,000 tons. Second cruise, 10 ships, 56,000 tons. And it goes to Japan, where it's destroyed in a harbor explosion that destroyed it and 2 Japanese ships. An accidental harbor explosion. And the Michael was going to attempt to break out in the Pacific from Japan. And the crew of the Michael was partly some of the survivors of the Thor. It goes to sea, and immediately the U.S. submarine Tarpan finds it and sinks it. So U.S. subs doing their job. The last thing I want to say is finally about the movie. There's a 1956 British movie called Pursuit of the Graf Spee, or the Battle of the River Plate. I just recently rewatched it. It uses the USS Salem as the Graf Spee. So the bottom right picture is the 3-turret USS Salem heavy cruiser, meant to look like the Graf Spee on the bottom left. The interior shots with German uniforms and German swastikas will all be shot on British ships because the Americans said, yeah, the Salem was part of the Mediterranean fleet at the time. We'll let you film us zooming around. We'll let you film a couple of shots on deck, but there's no freaking way we're putting a Nazi flag up on our ship, even for a movie. What's interesting about this movie is that the HMS Achilles and the HMS Cumberland, which actually took part in the Battle of the River Plate, reprised their roles in this movie. The actual HMS Achilles is there. The actual HMS Cumberland is there. I watched it. It's got 20 minutes of battle scenes included. It gets into the internment and it gets into the pre-bit. But in the 21st century, where everything's supposed to be an explosion every 3 seconds, it's kind of funny to have 5 minutes prior to the battle, 5 minutes of British sailors just walking around with binoculars going, I don't see anything yet. It's much slower pace of older 20th century
It's
film.
more realistic, if you want.
It's kind of sort of realistic, accurate naval procedures, if you will. It's kind of fun that way because of
It's
that.
also fun that they delve heavily into the uh, subterfuge that the British put on the Germans and all of the diplomatic arts going on in
Yeah.
Paraguay over the ship.
So, and they make Lansdorf look like a noble hero. But anyway, so that is the Graf Spee. I know we're almost out of time. The plan for our coming up talks, we've got 3 of them planned. January will be our infamous quiz with yours truly throwing all sorts of naval history. I didn't say that. Questions at you. Be prepared. Valuable prizes for the winner. The February thing, well, Phil and I will be talking about just how accurately AI can depict history. And we're having a lot of fun with that. And then in March, at the suggestion of one of our listeners, John, he wants us to talk about Freeman Dyson, a famed physicist. And we're going to talk about Freeman Dyson in a book that I just read about him. And Freeman Dyson is one of John Raminsky's favorite people on the planet ever. So we've got the next 3 planned. Frank, I'll take your idea. When we talk next, I will have picked out 4 random cards, and we can choose that to be from that to be one of the April discussion points.
This was great, Bruce. Thanks.
Yeah, there we go. So, any commentary? Anybody else want to say anything?
Thanks, Bruce.
Yes, thank you, Bruce.
Yeah,
All
thanks
right.
a lot.
Merry
Bruce.
Christmas. We'll all be talking next year then, everybody.
You
See
bet.
you in
Yeah.
26.
Happy
Yeah.
holidays all.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks.
Enjoy the
Take care,
holidays.
guys.
Bye-bye.
Take care.